The harsh fluorescent lights of St. Mary's Hospital bathed the pediatric ward in a cold, pale glow as David Carter carried his 3-year-old son Mason down the endless corridor. At 36, David's face bore the fatigue of sleepless nights and the silent burden of holding an entire world together with trembling hands. Mason, dressed in his favorite Superman pajamas, looked like a tiny warrior fighting his own invisible battle. The bright blue fabric seemed out of place in the sterile white halls, but it also brought a touch of color, of hope. Despite his illness, his wide eyes still held that spark of curiosity that broke David's heart every time he saw it. "Daddy, are the doctors going to make me feel better?" Mason asked softly, his voice echoing down the hall like a fragile whisper. David adjusted his grip, careful not to tug the IV line taped to his son's small arm. "Yeah, buddy. These doctors are the best. They're going to help you get all better." His tone was steady, but inside his heart trembled. For 6 long months, David had been waging a war he never thought he'd have to fight alone. Mason's rare blood disorder demanded constant treatments and long hospital stays. His job as a construction worker provided only the basics, never enough for the mountains of medical bills that came crashing down week after week. He'd burned through his savings, taken unpaid leave, and learned to stretch every dollar until there was nothing left to stretch. Still, he kept going, because stopping meant giving up, and that wasn't an option. Tonight, Mason's fever had spiked dangerously high. There was no time to wait until morning. David had scooped him up and rushed straight here, praying the hospital could do what he couldn't, save his little boy. As he walked deeper into the maze of white corridors, the air grew heavier. Fear crept in again, whispering questions he didn't want to answer. What if I can't afford this? What if I fail him when he needs me most? They passed the hospital's administrative wing, glass walls revealing a room full of well-dressed executives, laughing softly around a polished table. Probably board members, David thought bitterly, deciding budgets and policies while people like me are drowning out here. Then suddenly, Mason's small body jerked in his arms. Mason suddenly straightened up in David's arms, his small body trembling with excitement. "Daddy, look," he said, pointing toward the glass doors ahead. David followed his son's gaze, curious what could have caught the boy's attention in a place like this. Then Mason whispered with complete certainty, "That's Mommy." David froze, through the glass. He saw a woman standing at the head of a conference table, elegant, confident, and surrounded by people in suits who hung on to her every word. She wore a crisp white blouse and a navy skirt, her blonde hair neatly pulled back, her posture radiating power. Everything about her screamed success and control. David's throat went dry. "Mason, sweetie, that's not Mommy," he said softly, forcing a smile he didn't feel. But Mason only shook his head stubbornly, the way only children can. "It is Mommy. I remember her smell. And her voice." The words hit David like a punch. Mason's mother had left when he was barely a year old, walking out one night with nothing but a note that said she couldn't do it anymore. David hadn't heard from her since. Not a call, not a message, just silence. Before he could say anything more, the woman in the conference room glanced up, and their eyes met. Time stopped. For a fleeting second, her professional mask faltered. Shock flickered across her face, then disbelief, and something that looked heartbreakingly like regret. She murmured something to the others, then excused herself and headed for the door. David's pulse thundered in his ears, and when she stepped into the hallway, he knew Mason hadn't been mistaken. Despite the polished appearance and designer heels, it was her. Sarah Mitchell, the woman who had once been his wife, and the mother who had walked away. "David," she breathed, her voice trembling, as if saying his name reopened an old wound. "Sarah," he replied, his voice rough with emotions he thought had died long ago. Mason wriggled in his arms, reaching out eagerly. "Mommy, I knew it was you!" Sarah's composure shattered. Tears welled in her eyes as she looked at the little boy she hadn't seen in more than 2 years. "Mason," she whispered, barely holding herself together. David stood frozen, Mason between them, the space heavy with everything left unsaid. The woman before him was no longer the struggling young mother who'd left. She looked powerful now, successful, someone important. Sarah's voice trembled as she asked, "What are you doing here?" But even before David could answer, her eyes dropped to Mason's hospital bracelet, the IV line taped to his arm. Her face went white. "He's sick," David said quietly. "He's been in and out of hospitals for months. Tonight his fever spiked, and I had to bring him here." Sarah's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with panic. "What's wrong with him?" David swallowed hard, forcing himself to stay calm. "A blood disorder," he said quietly. "The doctors say it's treatable. But the care, the medication, it's more than I can afford." His voice was steady, but each word felt like it was tearing him apart. Sarah's gaze shifted to Mason, who was still reaching toward her with pure, unshaken love, as if the years of absence had never existed. Her lip trembled. Can I hold him?" she asked softly. David hesitated for only a moment, then nodded. He gently placed Mason into her waiting arms. The instant Mason felt her touch, he melted into her chest, small arms wrapping around her neck. It was instinctive, as if some deep part of him remembered her heartbeat. "I missed you, Mommy," he murmured, patting her cheek with tiny fingers. Sarah's breath hitched. She closed her eyes, clutching him tightly as tears streamed down her face. "I missed you too, baby." "More than you'll ever know," she whispered, her voice breaking on every word. David stood there, torn in half. Part of him wanted to hate her, to remind her of the nights Mason cried for her, the birthdays she missed, the pain she left behind. But seeing her hold their son, watching Mason's smile return, he felt something else, a strange, reluctant sense of relief. After a long silence, David finally spoke. "Sarah, what happened to you? Where have you been all this time?" Sarah opened her eyes and looked at him over Mason's small shoulder. "After I left," she began quietly, "I buried myself in work. I started a medical consulting company, and it took off faster than I ever expected. I became successful, wealthy even. But I convinced myself that you and Mason were better off without me." Her hand trembled as she brushed Mason's hair back. "I told myself I wasn't cut out to be a mother, that I was too selfish, too career-driven. I thought if I stayed away, maybe you'd find someone better for him." David's jaw clenched. "You never tried to contact us," he said, trying to mask the pain that still lived under his words. Sarah nodded slowly, guilt clouding her expression. "I was afraid," she admitted. "Afraid you'd hate me. Afraid Mason wouldn't remember me. Afraid that if I came back, I'd only hurt you both again." Mason looked up at her then, his big brown eyes serious in a way no child's should ever be. "Are you going to stay this time, Mommy?" The question hung in the air like a knife, sharp, impossible to ignore. Sarah's gaze flickered between Mason and David, her voice trembling. "If your daddy will let me," she said softly, "I'd like to try. I want to help. I want to make sure you get every bit of care you need, and every chance to feel better." David studied her face for a long moment, searching for truth, for regret, for something real. David studied Sarah's face, searching for any trace that this might just be another fleeting promise, something she'd abandon the moment life got hard again. But what he saw wasn't the same woman who had walked away 3 years ago. Her eyes held remorse, but also something new, determination, strength. Finally, David exhaled and said quietly, "Mason needs his mother." He paused, his voice cracking. "And truth is, I need help. I can't do this alone anymore." From that night on, Sarah slowly began to weave her way back into their lives. It wasn't easy, not for David, not for her. But she showed up. Every day, she used her wealth and her connections to get Mason into the best treatment programs, bringing in top specialists from across the country. But more than money, she gave something far rarer, her time. She became a presence in Mason's world again. She learned how to give his medications, sat through every appointment, and spent long hours reading stories, building block towers, and laughing at silly cartoons. At the hospital, the nurses began to whisper, not about Sarah the CEO, but about Sarah the mother who never left her son's side. 3 months later, Mason's condition had stabilized. The room that once felt like a place of fear now felt like a second home, filled with laughter, storybooks, and the soft hum of machines keeping rhythm with hope. One afternoon, as they sat together on Mason's hospital bed reading his favorite book, the little boy looked up with a serious expression. "Daddy, are we a family again?" David and Sarah exchanged a look, a silent conversation that said more than words could. They had been cautious, rebuilding trust piece by piece, taking it slow. David smiled softly. "We're working on it, buddy. What do you think about that?" Mason grinned, that pure, radiant smile that had carried them through every dark day. "I think families help each other when someone's sick, and families stay together." Sarah reached over and took David's hand, her eyes glistening. "He's very wise for a 3-year-old. David squeezed her hand gently. "Yeah, he is. He knew who you were, even